Greatly appreciate it. Good morning, everybody. Are you all caffeinated and ready to go? It's so great to be with you. Thank you for the privilege of gathering us, David, and addressing you this morning. I want to speak with you for a little while about some of the challenges in American higher education and some of the urgent priorities for IACE leaders. My title is The Abolition of Education and the Opportunity of the Moment. One of the most prophetic voices on education in the last 100 years was that of C.S. Lewis. Many of us know him for his children's writings, his science fiction, or as a Christian apologist, but not for his thoughts on education. His insights are dispersed over several books. Let me mention two of them. One of them, The Abolition of Man, very, very important book, written in 1943. It focuses on the decline of education in the British grade schools, and it's a reflection of what happens when you deny transcendent objective values. So in 1942, he came across two grade school texts. He doesn't give their names, he just calls them the Green Book. They promote the idea that all value statements are simply statements of feeling and personal taste. There are no objective values or truths. And Lewis was deeply bothered by this, because without an argument, they were smuggling relativism into textbooks on a variety of topics. And so he decided to respond with a series of lectures at Durham University, and later wrote it up in a short little book, and the full title was The Abolition of Man, Reflections on Education, with special reference to the teaching of English in the upper form schools. Some say this is the greatest defense of natural law ever written. Lewis himself considered it his most important book. And in that book, if you've read it, on one level, it's a critique of educational theory. On another level, it's an attack on epistemological, moral, and aesthetic relativism. And on still another level, it's a warning of the dark consequences that follow that would lead to not only the corruption of students, but would make them susceptible to mass manipulation, and in the future, an elite group of conditioners who will try to remake society and remake man himself, bringing about the abolition of man. So for Lewis, you deny absolutes, you're going to reap the whirlwind. Now, again, if you've not read this book, you have to as Christian educators. It's one of the most important books on Christian education I think you can read. It's dense, it's not a quick read, but it's worth it. The other book that I wanted to direct your attention to was, actually it's an essay that he wrote about education entitled Screwtape Proposes a Toast. And in that essay, written in 1959, he turns his attention from the grade schools to the university itself and the decline of rigorous education. It's a fictional essay, like Screwtape Letters, and it begins with a scene in hell at the annual dinner of the Tempters Training College for Young Devils, and up stands the demon Screwtape, the very experienced devil, and he rises to lay out a scheme to bring out more souls to hell. C.S. Lewis was taking issue with the rise of progressive educational theories and the socialist policies in Britain aiming to level educational outcomes at the time. And he says in that essay, democracy is properly the name of a political system, a system of voting, which he clearly valued. But he also said, there's a diabolical kind of democracy as well. It represented by a radical egalitarianism which resents every kind of superiority in others and wants to annihilate it. It says we must cut everyone down to the same level. It wants to discredit and eliminate every kind of human excellence, moral, cultural, intellectual. The basic principle of the new education is to be, quote, that dunces and idlers must not be made to feel inferior to the intelligent and industrious pupils, unquote. It frames exams so that everybody gets good marks. It doesn't advance brighter students, but artificially keeps them back, or it will cause trauma in other students. Rather than lifting everyone up, he says it dumbs society down. It creates a nation of subliterates. It's morally flaccid from lack of discipline. It's full of cocksureness, yet it is ignorant. It makes students soft from lifelong pampering and destroys the very idea of greatness. It leads to a nation without greatness, Lewis said. And then Screwtapes adds, this is what hell wishes every democratic people to be. It leads to, and here's Lewis's phrase, the abolition of education. If you've read Lewis and you've read his fiction, you'll see that his ideas pop up in his fictional writings as well, especially as he portrays different professors. So you have the rather lost soul of Mark Studdock in That Hideous Strength, or you see the diabolical Dr. Weston in Out of the Silent Planet, or Dr. Kirk in The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, who simply says, what are they teaching in school these days? Wondering at some of the new fads. In short, for Lewis, the new education undermines education as we've known it, where there's no objectivity, there's no truth, there's no moral law, there's no goodness, there's no beauty, there's no reason, there's no excellence, and underneath it all, there is the absence and loss of not just transcendence, but of God. So Lewis was many things. He was literary scholar, children's author, apologist, Anglican lay theologian, but on education, I believe he was prophetic. He has rightly been called the prophet of the 20th century because he saw things way ahead of time, and his warnings have proved accurate. Fast forward with me to American education in the 2020s. In the past 5 years, we've heard two loud alarms signaling all is not well. The first came in the world of K through 12 education, the second in the world of higher education. The first alarm came during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. During the pandemic and the shutdown of schools, many parents woke up to what was happening in their K through 12 schools. The shift to online learning was an eye-opening experience. Parents had a unique opportunity to look under the hood and see what was actually being taught to their children, and many were shocked. But the second alarm went off in higher education on October 7th, 1923. That date is remembered not just as the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust, but it will be remembered as a defining moment in American higher education as well. It was a time that revealed a deep moral disorder in many colleges and universities. We saw the eruption of anti-Semitism on campuses around the country, the harassment of Jewish students, the celebration of violence against Israeli citizens, the calls for the obliteration of the Jewish state. Equally disturbing was the long silence of so many presidents. And to make matters worse, on December 5th, 2023, 3 presidents from America's elite universities testified before Congress. And when asked if calling for genocide violates their university's code of conduct, they gave a non-answer. And it was disturbing because they had detailed codes of conduct about what kind of speech you can or cannot use and procedures of how to discipline for using the wrong speech. But it was revealing, and it revealed things had been turned upside down, and many said there's a massive failure at the heart of American higher education. And what these two events reveal, I think, is a movement away from the basics and an ideological captivity that has taken root in our system. Now, many people have been warning of this for a long time. Way back in the 1950s, Bill Buckley wrote God and Man at Yale. In the 1970s, Russell Kirk wrote Decadence and Renewal in Higher Education. In the 1980s, Alan Bloom warned about the closing of the American mind. In the 1990s, George Marsden wrote about the soul of the American university. In the 2000s, early 2000s, Anthony Kronman wrote about the loss of meaning in the university and in the minds of university students. In the 2010s, Harry Lewis from Harvard wrote about excellence without a soul. In the 2020s, John Ellis wrote about the breakdown of higher education. And they talked about many warning signs and issues that were rising up. The new shrunken vision of higher education, where the purpose of college seemed to be reduced and getting smaller and smaller. It's just about getting a job or a ladder to the middle class or maybe critical thinking, but nothing about the pursuit of truth or the transmission of wisdom or the formation of habits of character, let alone a foundation of faith. And they wrote about the loss of a center in higher education, how there's a new fragmentation, a siloing, Disciplines become islands because there's no integrating center holding it together. The university has become a multiversity. And they wrote about the corruption of the humanities dominated by identity politics and critical theory, and the lack of a common core. They wrote about the growing politicization of everything by radical politics. They spoke about the decline of free speech on campus and the rise of campus culture. There were others who wrote about the coddling of students, the overprotection, like Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Coddling of the American Mind, which describes how emotional reasoning and emotional safetyism and the ideas of fragility have created a victim mentality and a softness leading to practices such as trigger warnings and safe spaces to shield students from ideas they might find threatening. And these writers wrote about the new disdain for academic excellence and merit, and they warned of the dumbing down of coursework, and that there was a preoccupation with anti-formation and deconstruction. Bottom line is, they were saying, and many have added to their chorus of voices, higher education is in trouble. A great deal of university culture has become post-truth, post-wisdom, post-virtue, post-reason, post-excellence, not to mention post-Western, post-Judeo-Christian. And some say we are going postal. Now, hear me, I'm not saying every university is as bad as it can be. I'm not overlooking that the U.S. has built a massive university system that's had and still has extraordinary influence all over the world. Our universities still rank high by reputation and are the richest in the world. But many see that America's educational advantage is fading internationally, and a growing number of Americans now consider a college degree, including a degree from the Ivies, to be a questionable investment. So how did we get here? What's been happening? And the answer is, it happened slowly. And I want to call on two individuals to help explain it. It may surprise you what they said. The first is William Barr, the former two-time Attorney General of the United States. I had the privilege of having a conversation with him a year and a half ago about these things, and he's written about them in his book, One Damn Thing After Another. And he talks about the three phases of public education in America. And Barr simplifies it, but I think it's helpful. He says the first phase of public school education was shaped by the beliefs of American Protestantism, and it lasted pretty much until the end of the 1950s. The second phase of public education, he said, began in the 1960s and lasted up until the middle of the Obama administration, and he describes this as a phase of, quote, secularization by subtraction, meaning we did all the same things we used to do, but we're taking the God part out of it, the religious part out of it. He said, but then the third phase of public education, the one we're in right now, another shift has taken place that many people don't realize. Beginning in 2014, an ascendancy of militant progressivism settled into public education, and there was a shift from secularization by subtraction to what he calls secularization by indoctrination, where public schools embarked on a campaign spurred by the teachers' unions to indoctrinate kids with secular progressive beliefs. And Barr sums it up this way: the aim of many educators in the current phase we're in is not only to dismantle society's traditional conventions and norms, many of which rise from its Judeo-Christian inheritance, but it's also to indoctrinate students into a radical progressive ideology, a belief system shaped by postmodern thought, Marxism, racial and gender ideologies, and other isms. That was William Barr, a man who has looked into the system probably more deeply than any of us in this room. A second individual who attempted to explain what was going on was American legal scholar and former dean of Yale Law School, Anthony Kronman. Kronman wrote a book called Education's End: Why Our Colleges and Universities Have Given Up on the Meaning of Life. And in it, he provides a really helpful survey of the history of American higher education. He, too, lists three phases, or what he calls the three ages of the American college and university. The first he calls the age of piety, from the 17th century to the late 1800s. He said this phase was it was marked by a deep commitment to Christian education. From the beginning, he says all of America's colleges were Christian. In the first 200 years, many of the colleges were founded by denominations and churches. Then he says the second phase, he calls it the age of secular humanism, which he charts out from the end of the 19th century to the mid-20th century. He said it was marked by a deepening cultural skepticism, the marginalization of God and religion, the grip of Protestant Christianity loosened, church ties were cut. But still during this period, there was a belief in the liberal arts, a belief in human nature, a belief in the humanities and the importance of transmission. This was the era when I went to college, and Lawrence University was not a Christian college at the time, but you could still get a really good education there. But the present age, the third age that Croman speaks about, from late 20th century, especially the turn of the century, he gives no name to, but he says it turned on secular humanism and attacked it with more progressive ideas influenced by Marx, Nietzsche, and Foucault. He says that the big interest in this phase has been not truth so much, but power. And what I find fascinating, listening to just there are many voices, but two very prominent voices who've been deeply involved in the system, is they both note a crisis of liberalism and a rising of neo-Marxist or cultural Marxist ideas that's more radical than liberalism, less tolerant than liberalism, and is intent on a reconstruction of society. Wow, so thinking about that, seeing that sweep, I ask myself, well, where does this leave us? And I think it's pretty plain, we're in a strange place. We're in a place where, in terms of K through 12 right now, many parents are looking at other options than public schools. They're looking at charter schools. There's an explosion of classical schools, one of the best stories in Christian education in America right now. There's a huge rise in homeschooling. And in terms of the universities, the crisis of confidence in college education is just massive. The Chronicle of Higher Education has regular stories about this. Gallup charts it every July. We see more and more people saying that it's not worth it. The value proposition is just no good. And then now, here we are, 2025, and we hear many people calling for reform. We're entering a new moment of reaction where the pendulum is starting to swing in the other direction. And we hear many voices. For example, my old line liberal friends are saying, you know, we really need to just go back to the Enlightenment. Anthony Croman says this. That was the golden era of American education. Of course, Enlightenment liberalism, as it has redefined liberty, liberty being now radical autonomy, has actually undermined the idea of virtue and truth and restraint and the social capital we desperately need. And it's abandoned the Christian vision that provides the organizing principle of the university. Many of my conservative friends are saying, you know, what we really need to do is to go back to the 1950s. And they have lots of suggestions, many of them good, like we need to institute a core curriculum. We need to restore free speech and debate. We need to get rid of the extremism, end DEI, restore merit and excellence. Of course, the big question that I ask listening to them is, do we have the public will as a society to reform our public universities, and will these reforms actually go far enough? Some of this stuff is deeply embedded into the system. Well, the new administration of Donald Trump has an agenda as well, not only to get rid of DEI and break the ideological monoculture, but to eliminate the Department of Education and send things back to the states, and then form a national online patriotic university. This too is not a problem-free agenda, especially for Christian universities. Eliminating the Department of Education is still a long shot. It'll take an act of Congress. Gutting it is more likely politically. But decentralizing all its functions is complicated. And for some of us, it's not really good news if you live in the state of Colorado. And then forming a national online university. It'll not only challenge every one of our online programs, but besides, it's a big government solution that can easily be redirected by an executive order of the next administration, which probably will be more progressive. So I'm grateful for President Trump that he sees the problem and wants to course correct. But these reforms will not go far enough or deep enough. Some of my evangelical friends in Washington are saying, you know what, we should be preoccupied with the concerns and fads and trends of the secular system, and they spend more time pushing the edge rather than the center. But strangely, very strangely, for me anyway, right now, it's my Orthodox Jewish friends and my conservative Catholic friends who are saying, you know what, we need to go back to the sources. My Orthodox Jewish friends say, we need to go back to the Bible. Don, be bold for the Bible. My Catholic friends say, let's go back to biblical and classical sources. And you know what? I think they are onto something. Something like the Augustinian vision that affirmed the classical liberal arts but grounded them on the foundation of Christ and the Bible. So in closing, what is called of us right now as leaders who are here at the International Alliance of Christian Educators Conference? I want to set before you what I think are 4 urgent priorities for the days ahead. And there are many more you could list, but these are 4 that the Lord has laid on my heart. And the first is simply this: now is the time, my friends and colleagues, to lean into Jesus Christ and the Bible as never before, to lean into and not away from them. Because for too long, the strategy of many Christian schools has been to play down our distinctives or minimize them. It's a huge mistake legally, let alone educationally and theologically. Because Jesus Christ is the light of the world, and he has everything to do with education. And there would be no Western university if it were not for Jesus. And the early universities in Europe, they grew out of the Christian mission. And the early American universities did the same. He is the integrating center that gave birth to the Western schooling movement. He is the vital center that we need. Scripture says, in him all things hold together. And of course, the Bible, the book that made our world. Augustine, in his De Doctrina Christiana, which some have called the fundamental charter of Christian education, he writes, sacred scripture is the sole foundation of a truly Christian education. Augustine said, yes, the liberal arts are valuable. Plunder the Egyptians, but let us never forget our theological core. We have a center, what the secular academy has lost, that's caused it to become either dominated by the government or by business, because the old center has been lost. We have a center in Jesus Christ and in the triune God and in the Bible. And that's one reason I so love IACE and I'm so attracted to its mission. So number 1, lean into Christ. Let your light shine. Number 2, return to the time-tested educational model, what I call the 3 C's of competence, character, Christ-centered faith. That's a simple way of putting it. I hope not simplistic. It's a very old model. It's a model that gave birth to our best universities. Competence, we've always wanted them to be excellent at what they do, to know the basics and their subjects and their professions really well, to be their best. Character, we want them to become good men and women. We want a moral formation to take place. Christ-centered faith, we want a solid foundation under their feet. And what's happened over time is that model got whittled down, where the Christ-centered part got thrown out the window a long time ago, and they kept the character and competence part. And then they got rid of the character part because they couldn't figure out what good character was, especially from the 1960s on. And we're left with competence. And in this recent period, the whole idea of excellence and competence is being deeply questioned as wrong. And how do you have a university if all that fades away? But this model is very old. It's not new. It's not strange. It's what gave birth to our greatest schools, and it's our model. It brings good fruit. So it's time to return to a time-tested educational model of what I call the 3 C's. And third, urgent priority is this: we need to familiarize and fortify our minds with the great tradition. I get the impression from so many of my colleagues that we're just not familiar with our roots. Dr. Dockery has talked about this in some of his writings, but we're part of a great tradition. Christian higher education stands in a long tradition of faith-informed vision and scholarship, from the earliest Christian monastic schools to the current Christian universities, rooted in the scriptures, maintaining a conversation with classical Christian thought, including the early church fathers, and Augustine, and Cassiodorus, and Alcuin of York, and Hugh of St. Victor, and Aquinas, and the Reformers. There's wisdom and encouragement by this cloud of witnesses. They provide company for our journey and a map to stay on the right path. Become familiar with them. Let them be your friends and your allies to strengthen your core. And then finally, a final urgent priority is that I'm convinced that leaders in Christian higher education, Christian leaders like you, we all need to become bold apologists for Christ-centered higher education. Now, I believe that one of the chief jobs of the president and the chancellor or a provost or a dean is you're to be the chief believer in your institution and what you stand for. But I take it a step further. We now need to become apologists for Christian higher education, because these days the crisis of confidence is deepening so much that we have to make a constant apologetic, like a threefold apologetic. One, why university education is important, period. Two, why Christian university education is important. And three, I will add, why convictional Christian education is important. Because not all Christian education seems to be that convictional. But we have to constantly make this, not only to continue what we do, because people don't get it and they're wondering why, and it's an opportune time to speak. And friends, it's not hard to do, because contrary to popular opinion, we offer more and not less than other schools. The common perception is, oh, you're Christian, you offer less. You don't have all the bells and whistles. No, the truth is we offer more. The truth is a Christian liberal arts education remains the best education available to humanity. It educates the whole person, mind, heart, and will. It lays out a better vision of what it means to be a human being. It prizes wisdom. It lays a basis for and exposes students to goodness, beauty, and truth. It still believes in reason. It addresses the question of the meaning of life, saying there is one. There's such a thing as calling. It doesn't overlook character. It's receptive to the triune God and his revelation. It's locked into Jesus Christ, the one in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. It's the kind of liberal arts education that truly liberates. So, friends, this is our advantage. And that's why I believe this is a moment of opportunity. Right now, this chaotic moment in American higher education, this kind of dark moment, it's a moment of opportunity for Christ-centered schools. We have immense spiritual, moral, historical resources to draw on. And that's why I think we ought to listen to a prophetic voice like C.S. Lewis, so that true learning flourishes in our land, so that we move from deconstruction and anti-formation to the reconstruction of just sentiments and ordered loves and right reason, and from the abolition of education and the abolition of man to the restitution of education and the restitution of man. Thank you very much.